Yesterday and then this morning, we have been treated to a fine set of presentations and discussions dealing with religious freedom in the Middle East, in North Africa, the Americas, and Europe, even a bit of Eastern Europe, South Asia yesterday, and then this morning, the fascinating presentation that had to do with Nigeria and the Central African Republic. What we're going to hear now is really quite different in some respects. Although when you hear a little bit about the 30s and the 40s in Ukraine and Russia, you'll hear some things that sound very similar to what we're hearing in terms of the current situation. And yet, even having said that, there are pretty major differences when you deal with the former Soviet Union, which of course became 15 separate countries. And of course, China is a different animal, although it reflects many of the same characteristics that we saw in the Soviet Union. Just want to make a few introductory comments, and then I'm going to introduce our our panelists, and then last I will introduce our keynote panelist, Bishop Gudziak. The situation of Christians in the Russian Empire was never one, obviously, since the time of Peter the Great, of opposition to Christian faith as such. Rather, the problem of religion in the Russian Empire often centered on the favored status of the Orthodox Church relative to other Christian groups, and that could include even Orthodox, the Old Believers, Catholics, Protestants, etc. There was some persecution, but often it was discrimination. But of course, during the Soviet Union period, the Soviet period, 1917 on, the situation radically changed for all religious groups during that time. Usually during that time, the goal wasn't necessarily to eradicate all belief initially. This wasn't like in Eastern Europe where you actually had in the Constitution Albania a clause which did not allow you to even believe in God. You didn't have that in the former Soviet Union. The assumption was always, though, it would disappear. And so the hostility in practice in particular was something that was there to continually constrain the environment for believers. But there was a kind of sinister policy of domesticating the church, to use it, whether it was Orthodox or Baptist or Adventist or Pentecostal, had the tendency to split the church from between those who were part of what you might call the registered church and the unregistered church. The former, of course, being willing to play a little bit more by the rules, and often being the ones that were allowed to travel and have contacts with the West. And so not only were they domesticating the church, they were also causing deep divisions within the church. And so that's part of what we see. And during the late 1980s, and with the advent of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, things, of course, began to improve for Christians and other religious groups. And yet, what has happened since the demise of the Soviet Union is part of what we're going to hear about today, is in some respects perhaps a kind of throwback to the pre-communist period, and one wonders to what extent that's the same or different. The situation in China, of course, has been tough. Missionaries and others forced out in the mid-20th century, and yet, contrary to what many people would thought would be the case, Christianity did remarkably well at not just thriving, but in some cases, surviving, but in some cases actually thriving. We're going to hear a little bit this morning about what the situation is there and how it's changed even the last couple of years after a few years of apparent improvement. Now, our speakers today are really remarkable experts, and the three panelists, particularly who will speak after our keynote panelists, please forgive me that I'm going to allow people to use their biographies to get the central parts about what they've done. I will make this one observation. When I read the bios, I was struck by the fact that all of our panelists have been recognized by their professional colleagues for outstanding research and writing, which is really quite unusual. We'll be hearing from Dr. Kathleen Collins, who is an associate professor of political science at University of Minnesota. She's quite an expert on Central Asia. We'll also have Dr. Kaisel, Dr. Kasel's here, Dr. Collins there, and Dr. Kasel is an associate professor of political science at the University of actually Notre Dame, right? Got that right? And then our third panelist relative to China is a professor of sociology at Purdue University, Fengyang Yang, and he is a really fine and published scholar on that topic. But let me take just a few moments to introduce our keynote panelists today. And we're very privileged to have with us Bishop Boris Gudziak, who is the eparch of the Paris Eparchy of the Saint Vladimir le Grand for Ukrainians of the Byzantine Rite in France, Switzerland, and Benelux countries. How would you like to have that for a title that you try to roll out on occasion? But he's a leading intellectual and historian, globally recognized for his scholarly achievements, his pastoral abilities, etc. I was struck by the fact, if I got this right from your bio, you actually studied at this university. Is that true?
The one in Ukraine?
Well, the one here in Bono,
yeah,
right here, right where we are, which is the only one I know so far of our speakers who's done that. So spent some time here in the 1980s. An expert on the history of Ukraine and the church, an expert on a person considered one of the foremost theologians in the Orthodox Church in Russia, George Florovsky, who some consider just one of the best 20th century theologians, period. Bishop Gudziak is an active supporter of Ukraine's Euromaidan movement for dignity, and he's appeared regularly on leading global TV channels. In 2012, he was appointed as the bishop for Ukrainian Catholics, and he's been a defender of religious freedom, and outspokenly so in the press. In January 2015, he was awarded the French National Order of Legion of Honor for his life of preaching the message of freedom and dignity for all. Join me in welcoming Bishop Gudziak.
Thank you, Kent. It is a bit of a deja vu, going back 35 years. The world's different than it was then, and I think we can say thankfully so. We're studying, learning about great trials and tragedies, but I think all of us individually are very inspired by our participation in this conference, seeing the witness, seeing the seriousness, especially of the young generation of scholars that are informing us. So thank you for convening this, and thank you for inviting me. And a big thank you to the sponsors, and there must be many, because you're treating us very well. I will ask you to listen quickly, because there's a lot to share, and time is short. What are some of the take-homes? I hope that you can understand better what about 2 billion people are living. Those who are survivors of communism. And I will try to help you look at that by looking at a narrower scope. Those who lived in the Soviet Union, that's about 250 million people. And then there'll be a smaller picture, a case study, so to speak, very quickly. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, that's about 5 million people. For many human beings, almost a third of the population of the globe, there's a deep syndrome. It's almost in the DNA. There's a certain fear, and there's a degree of interpersonal distrust. And as George Weigel said, we shouldn't shy away from looking at the source of our life and our relationships, which is the Trinity. We're created in the image and likeness of God, and the whole story is, can we live like the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? That's what the gospel is about. That's what the Year of Mercy is about. That's what religious freedom is about. And those that want to play games with God's plan, make it their own, hit right at that point, at the question of relationship, interpersonal trust. How do you kill trust and relationship, peace, harmony, cooperation, freedom? It's not easy because it's God's plan and we want to live. But the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, through their wars, genocides, famines, repressions, killed about 180 million people. If we look at the Soviet Union, that's 9 time zones where for 3 generations, this experiment of creating a Soviet person, a new person, not the person in Christ, not the person created in the image and likeness of God, but handmade, manufactured, all the same, kind of like hamburgers at McDonald's. In Ukraine in the 20th century, about 15 to 17 million people were killed. Between 1932 and 1945, Ukraine was the most dangerous place on earth. So this experiment had a particular laboratory in a particular place. The Holodomor, which killed at least 4 million people, some people say as many as 7 million people, because you couldn't talk about it for almost half a century afterwards, was at the lowest estimates, was killing about 1,000 people per hour. On the most fertile land in the world, people were dying after an abundant harvest because every last grain, every last potato was requisitioned from houses at gunpoint, and in the winter of 32, spring of 33, millions of people were dying. Journalists from the New York Times were denying it, journalists who have the Pulitzer Prize to this very day. Durante is his name. You can look him up on Wikipedia. Of course, it was clear that to do that, you have to work very hard. It's not easy to kill somebody. We want to live. That is the strongest human reflex, to live and to live eternally. And so to kill millions, tens of millions, you have to work at it very hard. And there are people that do that. In the 20th century, there were whole systems that did that. There were people in the Soviet Union that got the highest national prizes for finding out where you can shoot a bullet in somebody's skull so that the smallest amount of blood comes out, so that in the prison cell, you will have the smallest amount of blood to clean up after the execution. Hitler studied how Stalin created the Gulag and imitated him. Another assiduous student was Saddam Hussein. People think about these things. People want to excel at killing. And one thing they do is they hit at religion. It's one of the first things they do. So Lenin, the father of 20th century state terrorism, in 1917, at the beginning of the revolution, said, we have to hit them hard, the church. We have to hit them so that they don't get up. We have to hit them so hard that the terror paralyzes them. And in January 1918, a few weeks after the revolution started, the Metropolitan of Kiev, the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, was killed near his cathedral. That began the elimination of the Orthodox hierarchy in the former Russian Empire. If it had about 100 bishops in 1917, by 1939, only 4 were left. That is the kind of percentages. It wasn't Albania, it wasn't 100%. It was only 95%. In terms of religious participation, it was 98, 99%. And here you can see some of the statistics on the churches. From 30,000 churches to 500. Incredible monuments were destroyed. Can you imagine somebody blowing up the cathedral in Assisi with the frescoes of Fra Angelico? There is St. Michael's Golden Dome, 11th century church, dynamited by Stalin in 1936. We will return to this church, which was reconstructed in the 90s. It became a symbolic place just months ago. The Russian Orthodox Church, after decimation, was called back to life during World War II in order to help the war effort as Stalin was desperately retreating before the Blitzkrieg of Hitler. But that came at a great cost. Many churches were opened, but the hierarchy, those that survived the persecution of the 20s and 30s, were able to act only in total submission, in profound collaboration, which we see to this very day. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church from 1945-46 to 1989 was the biggest illegal church in the world. It had about 4 million people, members, before the war. In the underground, after all of its bishops were arrested in 1945 and 46, it persisted for 3 generations, but it was reduced. Maybe 20, maybe 40,000 people were partially active in this community. These systemic totalitarian persecutions were real. They had limitless resources, and they had almost total results, but not total. There was always a last remnant. The number of priests was reduced from 3,000 to 300, again 90%. In terms of faithful, from 4 million, 40,000, that's 1%. If it was 20,000, it's 0.5%. But there were people that said, we suffered terribly because we didn't renounce our faith. But there are those who suffer more because they compromised. Mrs. Marta Tsahelska died just a few years ago, and many cardinals and journalists over the last 20 years came to speak with her about her testimony. Here are some of the pictures of the bishops who were arrested in 45. All 3 of those are now beatified martyrs, beatified by St. John Paul II in 2001. One who did not die, who survived 18 years in the Gulag, was the head of this church, Metropolitan Joseph Silipi. I had the privilege of living with him here in a small community of 15 people for 3 years. He kept the faith, and he kept supporting his faithful. These are sisters in the Gulag, a priest working hard labor in the forest. These pictures were very hard to get and very hard to preserve. These are some of the leaders of this unbowed church. Metropolitan Sheptytsky, who explicitly prepared the people for persecution, speaking clearly to the anti-religious, anti-Christian ideologies of the 1930s. Bishop Vasil Velichkovsky was injected with slow-acting poison and expelled from the country. He actually died in Winnipeg, Canada. It was doctors later that determined that he was martyred, and he is a beatified martyr. You can visit his relics in Winnipeg. The Spirit works always. It's irrepressible. So people gathered in front of closed churches at their risk. Here's a picture from the 70s. And then when perestroika liberalized all aspects of Soviet life, there was a demand for legalization. One of the best pictures from this time. These bishops from the underground, who were nothing, who were zero, who were coal stokers during the day as they ministered in the night, marching, you can see their freedom. They were the freest people in this prison of nations. And here they are in the Kremlin Square, in front of St. Basil's. You can see what blow the Ukrainian Greek Catholics took. The drop in parishes from 4,000 to 0, from 3,000 priests to 300 priests about 70 years old. Right now I have one of the smallest dioceses in the world in terms of numbers. I have 5 countries. I live in planes and trains. But on Sunday at my 30 parishes, there's about 1,200 people. And after running a university with 450 staff and, we'll hear about it maybe a little more later, but, a big, vibrant community, I thought, Lord, why do you send me here? Well, one reason is to share with Belgian bishops and French bishops, whose priests are on average 71 and 72 years old, that it's not always going to be like that. And let me tell you the story about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which in 1989 had 300 priests, average age 70, having had 3,000 50 years earlier. Today, this church has 3,000 priests in Ukraine or from Ukraine, average age 38, with 800 seminarians for 5 million people. France has 650 seminarians for 65 million people. It's not always going to be like that. In Belgium, in France, in Africa, it's not always going to be like that in China. And that is the importance of our meeting, for us to come together and to realize, God created the cosmos. He has some influence on things, but he speaks in an incredibly paradoxical way. He becomes one of us. And he's small. And wherever you're suffering, wherever you're tiny, wherever you're persecuted, there he will show his strength. It happens. It happened in my church. It happened amidst my people. And it's happening right now. And this is what you have to see through our general ignorance, through the purposeful obfuscation and propaganda. What is happening in Ukraine? People are moving from the fear of totalitarianism, which was driven into their DNA by sophisticated methods developed in laboratories. They're traveling in a pilgrimage from fear to their God-given dignity. That is what the Maidan is all about. That is what frightens Putin, because he can't control it. And if it spreads to Russia, the game is over. And so he is punishing Ukrainians for walking in their pilgrimage from fear to dignity. They thought they could beat up the students. They beat 100 students who were protesting in the night on Saturday morning, November 30th, 2013. On Sunday, 1 million people showed up in the square. And that monastery, that church, which we saw destroyed, which was rebuilt in the 90s, became a hospital for these people. And there you see, on December 1st, the March of Millions, of 1 million. In front of that church, that's that rebuilt bell tower, which Stalin dynamited in 1933. And then it was a festival, a new civilization, people coming together, feeding each other, giving the keys to their apartment in the middle of the night to a total stranger because it was 20 degrees below zero. Here is my apartment, keys, and my address. Go to my house, make yourself some tea, go into my bed. Can you imagine that, doing that in New York or Nairobi? That is God-given trust, which emerged and which is dangerous for tyrants. Yesterday was the second anniversary of the attempt to clear the Maidan after its first 2 weeks. And following our Holy Father, some of us came out there. I'm wearing what is essentially a Muslim hat. It was given to me by the leader of the Crimean Tatars. I wore it, one reason, because it's very warm. But of course, there were other symbolic reasons. And there's bishops there. The first one you can see kind of facing us is actually a bishop from Vancouver. There was a lot of prayer there. Day and night there was prayer. There was prayer, and you didn't see this on CNN or BBC. Every hour on the hour, through the night for 3 months. Interconfessional prayer. And then they thought again they could suppress it. So they started shooting. Shooting unarmed lambs going for slaughter. In the middle of the day, in the main square of the city, with the cameras of the world running. And when that sacrifice emerged, when that had been surrounded by the presence of the church and its witness, here's Cardinal Huzar, through liturgies, through weddings, confessions in the snow, when that was manifested in ecumenical and interreligious unity, that changed Ukraine. Here's a picture. This is a prominent Orthodox theologian on the right, a Greek Catholic priest, my predecessor as rector of our school, who spent a lot of time on the Maidan. 25 minutes before that tent chapel was burned by incendiary grenades. I was on the stage watching that chapel burn 25 minutes later. "36 hours later, in the presence of the foreign ministers in Kyiv of France, Poland, and Germany, the massacre occurred. About 80 people were killed that day. St. Michael's, again, the monastery, became a hospital with operating facilities. And the priests were there. The church was there, right there. And so the Heavenly Hundred was canonized. About 100 people were killed in those months. And that forced the president to flee. The Euromaidan won, but this pilgrimage from fear to dignity had to be punished. So the leg was amputated at the ankle. Crimea was annexed by little green men, not Russian soldiers. There are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And then the war began. There's no war. There are no Russian soldiers. There's no Russian arms. No Russian missile shot down MH17 with 298 international passengers, 90 children on board. There's 1.5 million internally displaced refugees. Probably another million outside of the country. Officially 10,000 killed. But, Ukraine has endured that. That was, a few hours of deaths of 1932, 33. People have decided to walk forward. The churches are involved. They've been offering leadership. They struggle in this pilgrimage, which will not end soon, because you don't leave easily the land of captivity. But this is why conferences are like this are important. Because we see the heart of the matter. The heart of a history that is the history of 2 billion people who lived under communist or still live under communist totalitarianism. We see the heart of Jesus' proposal. and our mission becomes clear. We rebuild, we discuss, we meet people. This is on the east side of the country. We support those who defend. And we give ourselves joyfully, voluntarily, with great confidence that the Lord is the Lord of history. And if only we can cooperate, if only we can walk in solidarity, the freedom that is our vocation, the dignity that is our call will be ours. Thank you for your attention.